Well, you're very, very welcome to Destination Uri. Late at night, Halloween night, 6 months of light has gone, 6 months of darkness is about to commence. It is Halloween, the fireworks have gone off, the bonfires have been lit, and we're going to deepest South Armagh, where we're going to be talking to the legendary Shanachie Una Welsh. Una, I believe you're in deep South Armagh somewhere. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what you're going to be talking about, but I do know that you're going to be telling us some tales, some mystical tales of the going ons in South Armagh. I see a fire behind you. I wonder what is going on. Over to you, Una.
Thanks, Damien. White, but while I'm Fáilte Rivgaji and Droghad and Arrogate, you're very welcome to Silver Bridge, which is deep in South Armagh, we're happy to say. So you're welcome to our celebration of Samhain. And what is Samhain? So Samhain is one of the four Celtic quarter years. The Celts came to Ireland from across Europe about 500 BC, and they were at their height in this part of Armagh in Owenwaha between 100 BC and 100 AD. Of an oral tradition. So they weren't known as the Celts until people started to write history, and then that's the name that came on them. But all of the core of our identity, our music, our language, our traditions, all of the things that we carry dear to us now have all come from the Celtic people. And if you consider all of the things that has happened throughout Ireland from that time, that didn't stay. The Celt tradition has stayed with us. So Samhain, as one of the four Celtic quarters, the four Celts quarters of the Celtic year, in Ballag on the 1st of February, Baltan on the 1st of May, Lunasa on the 1st of August, and Samhain on the 1st of November. And the most special of those four are the two, Baltana and Samhain. Baltana on the 1st of May is the opening of the half year of light, and Samhain on the 1st of November is the opening of the half year of darkness. And from the half hour of half 11 on the end of Lunasa until half 12 on the beginning of Samhain was the time that the spirit world and the mortal world joined together, when the graves opened and the spirits walked and people mingled for that hour. So that's the hour that we're going into and the hour that we're going to talk about. We're going to do as we've done in previous programs. We're going to talk about how that plays itself out in South Armagh, how it played itself out across Ireland, and how we're all part of a history that we're going to join up tonight. So first of all, to open the programme, we're going to have a song from Blahi McCann, and Blahin's going to talk about the closing of Lunasa, of the half year of light. Okay, Cathal, can we have Blahin?
Geez, August Bannock feeling a sound indeed. Una had asked if I might give song to tie into tonight's festivities. Um, so this is An Chailleach Riwach, very much a South Armagh local song. Um, References are made in the song to the Cassu Cam, which is a bend in the road just before Clonelake School, actually. And there's also specific surnames and people mentioned in this that we know are connected to other townlands round about Crossmaglen, Courtban, and Foxfield. So yes, very much a South Armagh song I have gone with tonight. Surprise, surprise. And I've also gone with this one because it does reference Ich Rivina Hauna, so the night before the month of November. And that shows the importance that would have been placed on this time of year. It would have been definitely a date on the calendar. And it also, this song, An Chailleach Riwach. So the Chailleach is a hag or a witch. And we know, of course, of the Chailleach Beara that is said to live in the cairn at the top of St. Gullion. But this is a different Chailleach that was part of the customs and traditions here in South Armagh in times gone by. And it would have been a hag, or essentially a corn dolly that was made with the last sheath of corn at the end of Lunasa, or the end of the kind of the autumn harvest. where they took in the last sheep after there was a whole big deal made of cutting it, and it was fashioned kind of, I think, with three plaits into a sort of a decorative shape and hung somewhere of prominence in the house, as a kind of symbol of the like living spirit. It was a pagan tradition really, of the harvest, and it would have been kept, and then the seeds would have been sown in the next spring, or they would have been given to the animals or that. But that was the Cailleach, and like I say, there's a lot of reference to be found that this was something that was practiced here in South Armagh. Michael J. Murphy talks about it in his book At the Foot of Slieupgullion, and in other things that have been documented on harvest time in Armagh. I have got the information from Padraig O'Hanlon's book, A Hidden Ulster, and she is fairly confident that that's the Cailleach that this song is talking about, not the Cailleach, the witchy figure that sometimes is referenced. So this is An Cailleach Weewak. Casú can na father ní ar bhil seach sa tlíogait, ar hiú de láha de se dit bhí na cailí riúí. Ó gur am ó chrí a chalín bog a gan gom na blianort, or ó bhéon se gad a galrachan ar hiú na cailí riúí. Bhí bunní chin is nedí bog a tléhain, sé bhfuil bog a darsaí dit camíon an Cailleach riúá. Ba I rin na man na mór agus barin naman siach, de réir mar deir le daltíní gur ó cuara car an chilí. Ó gur am ó chrí a chalín bog a gan na gom na blianort, or ó bhéon se gad a galrachan ar hiú na cailí riúí. I bhí na haúna ag tar an fón an tíarna, bhí Nancy gós na gasar ag a crack na cailí riúí. Bhí Waterloo shall Hamilton, sví landladies vi félon, sé cluise me na daltíní gur ó cuara car an tílon. Ó gur am ó chrí a chalín bog a gan na gom na blianort, or ó bhéon se gad a galrachan ar hiú na cailí riúí. Da becca mi holo bonni kennigam glen na cleawan, a crinju our chinna la haya dan vi kappa green. The and Kionna Nakaga Doris, you harvest city here the Svinin na Kali Riwi, Samara Giri Jerka. Oh, Garamokri Makali Bogtagiana Gumna Blinort, or Ovin Chagada Galrakan or here na Kali Riwi. Anish Chanela Noraku a haste off and cheeran. A Caragajuk na nosan, Shin Brosna na Kali Riwi. Gurmaigif. So Shin and Kaliak Riwak. There are several.
Said about the Cailleach. The custom of the Cailleach is very old. It is really based on pagan belief that the spirit of the harvest remains into the harvest until the last straw on each farm has been cut. The plaiting of the last straws is inspired by a mythological and symbolic assumption that in order to keep the goodwill and the luck of this spirit, it must be bound in the straw before being released in the final cutting. Now, I love history, and anyone that talks to me knows that I love history. And I love books. The smell of a book and the feel of a book, there's something special about them. But the oral tradition, as recorded and collected by Michael J. Murphy, the oral tradition is the lifeblood of local history and of an area. And South Armagh has been particularly blessed by the oral tradition that we have managed to carry on. When other areas have lost those traditions, we have held them. So when you talk tonight about Halloween and the modern Halloween that we are now celebrating, all of its traditions we can link back to the old pagan Celtic festival of Samhain. Because in that half hour before and after the new year, the lunacy year finished, half year finished, and the Samhain half year started. When the spirits walked, one of the things that between mortal being and spirits, and that you were safe from the spirit world, was they put on costumes and they wore masks. So you met somebody and you didn't know whether you're meeting a mortal person or whether you're meeting somebody from the spirit world. Just exactly as we do today, we buy children Halloween masks and we dress them up exactly the same. The other thing that was particular to the Samhain festival was that the door was left open and there was food provided for your dead ancestors and for the people from the spirit world that came. You had to provide food, you had to welcome them to your door. So people talk about trick or treating, and they say that trick and treating is an American custom that was brought over here. The people who brought that custom to America were the Irish immigrants. The population of Ireland has always been a population of emigration. So the people who went to America brought with them the old customs of the Celtic festivals, and that became what we now talk about as trick or treat, where somebody comes to your door, you open your door, you don't refuse anybody at the door, and they ask you for something, and you give them something that's in your house. Just exactly the same as the tradition that was part of the Samhain festival. So how do we trace a footstep of the Celts in the South Armagh area? Well, one of it is by the stories, and one of the big stories, I suppose, that has travelled worldwide in terms of the Celts and of the Fianna were the stories of Cumhullen, the Red Branch Knights. The main part of the Celts live in places in Armagh. All of the big story of the Celts for here is based from Armagh city back up through South Armagh into the very edge of North Louth, in the area that we're very, very familiar with. But at Armagh, at the headquarters, what the children now call Navan Fort, was the headquarters of the Celtic people. And the ruler of the Celtic people at that time, King Conor MacNessa. And the story that we have taken then from that had been handed on, firstly as an oral tradition, before they became written into what became known as the Ulster cycle of history. So Setanta, as a boy, Setanta's mother was Dactra, sister of Conor MacNessa, king of the Celts at Aaronwaha, and his father was Lu. Lu was the sun god. Lu was the god that Lunasa, the festival of Lunas, is named after. Lu was the god that County Louth is named after. That's where Louth gets its name from. So Setanta, born on the plains of Northema, just outside Dundalk. The motto of Dundalk is we had the birthplace of Cumhullen the warrior. But born outside Dundalk, and at 6 years of age left Dundalk and went to train with the Red Branch Knights at Aaronwaha. Left Aaronwaha one day to go to a feast on the slopes of Gullion with the blacksmith Cullen, one of the most important people in the Iron Age and the Celtic tradition was the blacksmith. So they went to a feast on the slopes of Gullion, and when they came to Cullen's Forge, the rest had gone in and Setanta was behind, and when he arrived the gates were closed. And Cullen had put his hounds out to guard the gates, and to get himself entry he drew the hurley, hit the slither and choked the dog with the slither. And Cullen was very angry. He said how would he guard his forge now? And Setanta said until a new hound was trained that he would guard the forge. So Setanta's name changed to Cumhullen, a name that's familiar right across the world now as some of the tales that have come out of Ireland. So Setanta's name changed on the slopes of Gullion here in South Armagh. It's a wonderful tradition to be able to hand on to children. So one of them is by the stories, and the other is by the places that we can go to, and to the hill forts that were part of the living. So if you put on the slides, Cathal, we'll go through the slides and see where we trace the Celtic footsteps in South Armagh. So your first slide is just Samhain. It's just giving you the name. And the next slide, Cathal. Now, this is taken from the Hill of Fahard. The Hill of Fahard was an Iron Age fortification. That's what the Celts brought with them. The Celts brought the making of iron. So they, something that they had brought with them was something that was still used, maybe not as much in South Armagh now, but certainly used in South Armagh as I was growing up. The plough still had part of its fittings were still used with iron. The blacksmith was still very, very much part of the growing up here. So that's what the Celts have brought with them. So the Hill of Fahard, just inside County Louth, on the edge of the Gap of the North. If you take your bearings back to the north, you're coming through the Gap of the North. But where you're standing looking at now is the plains of Merthemna. Back down over the range of Dundalk, heading out by Dundalk Bay and heading back round on the birthplace of Cuchulainn, of the by warrior that was Setanta. So the next one, Cathal. Now, this is where we start to look at some of the traditions as well that we brought forward. So this is Bridget's Well, inside Fahard Graveyard. And this now is a Christian holy well. But this is coming directly from the old Celtic tradition, because the Celts worshipped water and wood. Those were the two things. Water, particularly for its healing powers. So in all of the old stories of the Celtic people, there are stories of where people went to where water flowed when somebody was sick. If the person that was sick wasn't with them, then they brought something belonging to that person. They dipped it in the water and they took part of it back home and they left part of it back there. So just before we look at that in greater detail, to look at Bridget. Bridget, before she became patron saint of Ireland, and all of the stories that go around Bridget as patron saint of Ireland, Bridget was a pagan goddess. And she was the pagan goddess of Imbolc on one of the Celtic quarter years, Imbolc on the 1st of February. And what happened when Christianity came, as in all phases of history, they just moved the stories that people were familiar with. They moved them from being a pagan story and they put a new Christian identity on it and they resold the story. So Bridget, as the pagan goddess, became Saint Bridget, the Christian saint. But her place at Fahard was on top of an Iron Age fortification, on the place where the pagans had lived. Her feast day in the Christian calendar on the 1st of February retained the feast of Imbolc of the old Celtic quarter year. The story of her holy well was the story of the pagan well and the healing. So you can see where the Celtic tradition just moved seamlessly into the story that was a Christian story. So as pagan goddess of Imbolc, she was the opening of spring, and that was part of what she did. The only part that the Christian identity didn't bring with it was the fact that as a pagan goddess, she was goddess of fertility. So the church let the fertility bit go to one side. But as I was growing up, at a time where older women certainly had no conversation of any sort of a sexual nature in the hearing of young girls or unmarried women, I would have heard old women say to a couple where there were no children, they would say very quietly, just go up to Fahard. And I assumed, until I started to question things, I assumed that that was to do with Bridget as a Christian saint. And I realised afterwards that that was much more to do with Bridget as the pagan goddess and her role within fertility. And that had been handed on as an oral tradition, and that the women had stayed with that story, and that was why they were telling people to go to Fahard. So Fahard is one of the places that we trace the footsteps of the Celt. If you go to the next slide, Cahill, on the next slide is the bush. This is the bush just beside the well in Fahard Old Graveyard. And you can see that to this day, that when people go to that well, they have left parts of ribbons, parts of clothing, things that they had brought with them to dip into the water of the well. They have taken them and they have left them there beside the holy well that they go to in for Bridget in Fahard Graveyard. And it's the same if you go to Killeavy, to Menina's well at Killeavy, you'll see the same bush beside her well. So that tradition moved right down through. So we're talking about a tradition that's 2,000 years of age, that has withstood all of the other things that changed within the world, and that people, when they go to it, will still do what somebody was doing on that hill 2,000 years ago, which shows the power that Celtic tradition created and how we held on to it. If you go to the next slide, Cal, just before we leave the graveyard. And your next slide, the next slide is, and it is a Christian tradition, but I just wanted to show it because maybe there are people that haven't been in the old graveyard at Fahard. This is the remnants of where there would have been a high cross, just the same as there would have been at some of the bigger places, the Lake of Melifin. There was a beautiful high cross at one time here in the graveyard of Fahard. And how did Fahard get its name? Because Fahard, again, linking to the story of Cuchulainn, Cuchulainn's forces fought Queen Maeve on the southern hill at the side of Fahard in a great feat of arms. And that's how the name, that's what Fahard means. Fahard means feat of arms. So the name of the place, and that's something that we've talked about at many of the other sessions that we've done, is the names, and more particularly the townland names, and how important those townland names are in the tracing of our history. If you go to the next slide, Cal. The next slide should be a short video piece. And it's on the Dorsey, so I'm hoping that we can get it up and going. Now, this is me walking, you can hear my footsteps, walking through a piece of the Dorsey. The Dorsey was a linear earthworks from the Iron Age. And a linear earthworks means, and you'll see it as you're walking through it, there's a low ditch and two high banks each side. And you'll see as you come to the end of the video, you'll see an artist's impression of what it looked like when it was in its state as it was built. So low ditch, two high banks, and at the top of each bank was a palisading of wood. Now, Dorsey means the gateways. This was the route way to Auanwaha. This was the entrance through South Armagh that was bringing you down to Auanwaha, to the headquarters of the Celtic people and Conor MacNessa. So the Dorsey is an extremely important part of the Iron Age story and of the tracing of the Celtic steps. And we're right on the edge of the Dorsey at Silver Bridge. And we're right on the edge of the ring that is the Ring of Gullion, that's formed 59 million years ago. So as Damien said, we're deep in the heart of South Armagh, and not a better place, not only in South Armagh, but in the rest of the world could you be than where we're sitting here tonight. If you go to the last slide on that, Cahill. Yeah, this last stone, this is the stone at Tulnaval. This is in the field beside the Dorsey, but in the next townland, in the townland of Tulnaval. And Tulnaval means the place of the hedges or the enclosure. So this was a route marker. These standing stones first appeared in Ireland at the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age was the age that was just in front of the Iron Age. And through the Iron Age, they have had different uses. Some of them have been marking burial sites, but that one at the edge of the Dorsey and in the field at Tulnaval was the route marker, just exactly the same as a mileage marker that we had, or a thing that was telling you how many miles it was to the place. When somebody was coming across Ireland and looking to get to Aaron, that stone told them that they were on the right road that was going to bring them to Aaron to visit the court of Conor MacNessa. So that's where you trace the footsteps of the Celtic people within the South Armagh area. And you trace them again, as I said, in the stories that we told. So what that big story of Cuchulainn, of his becoming Cuchulainn from the By Satanta, of his place within the stories that take in Queen Maeve and the Brown Bull of Cooley, and of the fact that he fought Ferdia on the slopes of the Hill of Fahard when Queen Maeve's forces were retreating. And where Cuchulainn met his death at the stone at Knockbridge, the standing stone, not unlike the stone that we're after looking at in Tulnaval. And Cuchulainn as a warrior, as one of the Red Branch Knights, Cuchulainn couldn't die lying down. So when he knew that he was in the throes of death, Cuchulainn went to the standing stone, tied himself to the standing stone so that when he died upright. And such was his reputation as a warrior that for 3 days nobody approached him until the Maragon, the witch, came and in the shape of a raven went on his shoulder, and when he didn't move, they knew that he was dead. And the Sidhe, the fairy women, came and took the soul of one of their own because he was the son of the sun god Lu. The Sidhe women came and took the soul of Cuchulainn from his standing stone at Knockbridge. Now, I can't begin to tell you the sense of pride, because if you go to the GPO in Dublin, you'll see a bronze statue of Cuchulainn with the raven on his shoulder and his head dropped at the side in the death throes. I can't begin to tell you the pride that I have in a story that has travelled the world and has its roots here in the couple of miles where you're going from the side of Slievegullin, where Cuchulainn got his name, up through to the Hill of Fahard, where he fought his battle, and another couple of miles to Knockbridge, where he died. In a story that has crossed the world, South Armagh and North Louth is central to that story. So it's that has an immense pride within an area like South Armagh to be able to know and to trace where those stories came from. So we started off talking about this being the half hour of the closing of the half year of light and the opening of the half year of darkness. And where that is very much part of this whole story, I think that light and darkness is something that is not only part of that crossing over, but it also, in a lot of cases, has a very personal story that's told as part of that. So as we're coming up, just as we're coming up now, very close to 12 o'clock, where we're going to go into the half year of darkness, if you just put up the pieces you have of Bernie Cahill. This is Bernie Muckian, and I'm going to allow Bernie to tell her own story and to introduce her pieces of music.
Hi, I'm Bernie Mulkean. I've lived in South Armagh for 35 years and a fabulous place to live. When I was asked to take part in this celebration tonight, a celebration of light into darkness at Halloween, I immediately thought of my Eileen, my niece's beautiful little son Harry, who at the age of 2.5 passed away from meningitis at Halloween. This was 3 years ago, and a very, very sad and devastating time for my family, for Eileen and her husband Aled, and my brother James, who Harry was his grandson. I wrote these tunes to celebrate the short life of Harry and the fun he was. The first tune is a lively jig, and it reminded me in particular of my favourite memory of Harry was one day when I was visiting. We were outside and he was chasing me around the garden with his little toy dinosaur, and I was running around a tree and he was running round and round after me. So the tune goes round, and that's what it reminded me of. I wrote it's called Harry's Games. The slow air that I played is called Heaven Gained an Angel. The first part of it reflects when I got the news that he had meningitis, and the last part, which turns into kind of a Celtic lament, is when we realised that Harry had passed on, and that that he was gone. And I'd like to raise awareness of meningitis, and despite the fact that COVID is the big fear now, meningitis and other illnesses are huge for many, many families in Ireland. And tonight, on Halloween night, I want to very specially remember Harry James Ingman.
So apart from it being deep in the heart of South Armagh, why would we be in Silverbridge? Why have we chosen to be in this place tonight rather than any of the other parts of South Armagh? Well, we're here because we talked about the Celtic people and the worship of water and the importance and significance of water within that and the healing of water. So on my right hand side, we have Mary and Margaret, and on my left hand side, we have Kathleen. And they're going to tell us exactly why, because this place is An Tobar, and An Tobar is the well. They're going to tell us why we're here tonight and their own personal story of this place.
Hello everyone, I'm Kathleen, and thanks Una for that introduction, and we've been fascinated listening to everything there. Tonight we have brought water from our own well here. We have a field on the farm just off behind us here called Tobar, and it's a field that's still called Tobar, has always been referred to as such in the family. And just below it is another field called Craignastill, and in that field we are told that people came and there was a ritual of mixing water from 3 wells, and the 3 wells, ours is the one in the middle, and there are 2 others sort of as the crow flies, all within maybe a mile or so of each other here. And we've brought the water together tonight to sort of reenact that ritual. The story goes that the water was mixed together. Now, it was a very secretive affair because it was frowned upon by the church, and our grandfather was the healer, and it would have been something that would have been handed down, as Una spoke about the endurance of the Celts and the rituals that endured despite the church really, and changing from pagan into Christian stories. So that was done, but unfortunately our grandfather, he died back in 1955 when my mother was quite young, and although we've heard the stories that some of the what was behind the story has been lost. And funny enough, I was reading Michael J. Murphy today at Steve Gullion's Spot, and one of the things he said, which didn't make me feel so bad then, was the recipes or ritual of the healer were held as totally ineffective unless by the one entitled by hereditary to dispense them. That was recognised. It is due to this respect and recognition that one cannot always ascertain the ingredients used in external appliances or the rituals observed. So it is, in a way, it's understandable that because it was such a secretive thing and because it was passed down through families that it has been lost. But in some ways, what we're doing now here in An Tobar in Silverbridge, we're kind of hoping to reenact that legacy and pass it on down to further generations as the descendants of our ancestors here who would have who would have seen the value of the well and the healing properties of the well. So we're hoping that in some way that we're going to pass that on in our own way. So with the water here from the 3 wells, and myself and Mary, with 2 generations of the family here, and we're going to mix this water together. Right, so, and I'm going to hand you over to Margaret. She's going to tell you a bit more about the water and the well on the farm.
Well, I suppose as we gather here tonight to celebrate the Celtic Festival of Samhain, we are reminded of the sacredness of the place to the Celtic people. They revered the rivers and the streams, and they lived by the seasons. Trees in particular were revered, and I'd like to think that in our own small wee way here at An Tobar, we are bringing that all along into the future for our children and our children's children. We have planted 13,000 native trees here, 3,060 oak, and 1,224 hazel. The hazel would have been very much seen as the tree of wisdom by the well, and at our own well here at Tobar, we have an ancient hedge of hazel. So it's no accident that is still there today and hasn't been touched in any form. I suppose there's an urgency now in 2020 that we remember these traditions, and that we just don't remember, that we act.
because of the threat to our environment and the threat to nature and wildlife and trees. And I'd like to think that we will act upon this as quick as possible for the sake of future generations.
And I think those are things that Michael J. Murphy very much focused on in some of the stories that he recorded, and certainly in some of the stuff that he wrote. And I think Kathleen has a couple more pieces there. The Celtic people and the generations that followed them, for the turning of the earth, for the turning of the moon, and this is a special night here as well on the moon part of it, because although it's cloudy now and you can't see it very well, this is a full moon, and because it is the second full moon within this month, it's known as a blue moon. And earlier on tonight, when it was a bit clearer, there was a really good view of the blue moon, of the full moon. So if some of us take a wee bit of a wobble, there was always a lot of stories told about things going wrong on the night of the full moon. So on 2 full moons, you wouldn't know what would happen. But those people very much in contact with the earth, with the value of being close to nature, as Margaret said, and as they are now redoing here at An Tobar. That was very much part of how that worked. And some of Michael J.'s writings very much tell us that.
Since man first turned the soil with his crude spade, revolutionary changes have merged into progress which has created new worlds above the soil, but it is still the same soil. It reveals that one even feels the close natural kinship which exists between man and earth, and which must always exist if man is to survive. It is regrettable that only those in constant communion with the soil are really aware of this important fact. The people were very humane, for frugal living, like states of emergency, compel people to be less selfish, less unsociable, and more like one family. That is why their expression was free and natural. And that's reminding me very much of this year with the COVID pandemic, that it's people are coming together and the importance of that and the importance of community, which is something that with Celts would be very much.
Yeah, and how that actually played itself out in that modern pandemic, that you began to see that again coming back to people. So that very much, I think an area like South Armagh has never really strayed very far from that tradition. And one of the things I suppose that was part of those traditions was the role of women, because we talked about Bridget as the pagan goddess, we talked about her then as the Christian saint, we talked about Menina as the Christian saint, Bridget O'Farr, Levy, Bronan or Strever. The women were much more visible within that whole Celtic society and the society that followed on from there. And it was only in later years that women's role became much less central. And sometimes people will say, well, when you're talking about an oral tradition and you don't really have a lot of proof, how do you show that there is any truth to that? But Ireland was governed very much by a system of Brehon laws. And those Brehon laws, when you go through them, really does show you that there was much more of an equality between the genders within that rule than there was in the later rules that came in, especially in the after the famine years, where things became much more strict within that whole Catholic tradition. So I think, as well as recognising that role of it, that we recognise the role of women within all of that society. And tonight, I think especially that we recognise that oral tradition and the oral tradition that was carried on by Michael J. and how he regarded it as one of the most important parts of gathering any sort of history, because he talked about gathering the stories from the old people. And they would say to him when he asked them for a story, "Actually, they're only old tales." And he then wrote that one veritably hears a breath from down the centuries, and an important breath. One hears something that has been handed down from family to family, and is yet sweetly alive for all its age. So I suppose one part of doing this here tonight has been showing how we have held on to all of that. But one of the things as well is the writings that have been done and the poetry that has been done on Samhain. And how much more I think in later years that the whole role of those quarter years were important. We're not very far from Newton Hamilton. Newton Hamilton was the only place in South Armagh that had a hiring fair, and the hiring fair was done on a 6 months rotation. That hiring fair was in May and November on the old Celtic years. You know, there are so many traditions and things that are part of the stories that we grew up with are directly linked back to those quarter years. But a poem by John Montague, who was a beautiful poet, and his poem is Samhain. Sing a song for the mistress of the bones, the player on the black keys, the dark harmonies. Light jig of shoe buckles on a coffin lid, harsh glint of the wrecker's lantern on a jagged cliff, across the ceaseless glimmer of the spume, a seagull's creak. The damp-haired, sea-stained, sorceress marsh flight of the feet. Chill of winter, a slowly fading fire, faltering desire. Darkness of darkness, we meet on our way in loneliness. Blind Carlin, blind Rafferty, blind Tag. So the story of Samhain retold in the modern story of a poetry. But more, and we've talked about it here today when we were setting up, more around how the older people that we grew up with, because we are part of a link of the same family, but the older people that we grew up with, how instinctively they did the seasons and how they regarded the half year of darkness. Because the crops were finished, we talked about the callia, the harvest was cut, the grain was in, the work outside was done, and people, almost like the animal, moved inside. And other people then came and they ceilidh and they came into the house and they exchanged stories and they kept the oral tradition going at that time. But we as a modern people almost feel that we invented this whole thing of well-being. You know, we think, and you listen now to all of the scientific evidence that proves the value of light, the sun god Lu. We listen to people talking about the lack of social intermingling leads to isolation and leads to depression. The older people handled it. They handled it quickly and seamlessly because they followed the seasons and the turning of the earth.
And I suppose, Una, there's a comfort in that. For I know a lot of people, and understandably, a lot of people dread these few months and the dark nights and the candlelight and just the somberness of it all. But if there's comfort to be had knowing that people always did this and that they handled it and they got through it, and that for me that's a great comfort that it's tradition and it's kept going through all these years, that people keep each other company and they look after each other. and ward off social isolation and loneliness through the dark days. And I suppose no time is more relevant than today, particularly with the pandemic we're going through at the moment.
Yeah, and I suppose that was an important feature tonight of recognising the closing of the half year of light and the opening of the half year of darkness. To recognise that that's part of nature, that it's part of our life, and that we had ways of handling it. And that they knew how to do that, and that somewhere from my generation on probably were the group of people who decided that those were very old customs that were quite silly, and that we shouldn't really be bothered with them until a new group of scientists and doctors and all sorts of other people came along and said, no, actually, that was very sound, sensible advice, and you should have been doing what your mother told you all along. So that's part of it. I think we're going to have another song, Cathal, and if we can put on Bridge. And Bridge is going to sing, Bridge Murphy, a beautiful singer-songwriter here from South Armagh. She's going to sing Clahinia Winds, and there's a lovely, lovely supernatural lilt and story to this song. So if we can have Bridge.
The shadows fell across the room as I lay down to rest. The storm was raging deep inside my head. I fell into a restless sleep of crazy changing dream. I woke to find you standing by my bed. Clahinia winds were blowing when you called me. First you spoke my name. Your voice was still the same. You beckoned me and I arose to follow where you led. Out amongst the wild Clahinia hill. The mountain mist had lent an eerie whiteness to the hill. The silvered spider threadings caught my face. You darted through the bracken, trailing stardust in your wake. I knew you'd stop beside our sacred place. Clahinia winds were blowing when you called me. First you spoke my name. Your voice was still the same. You beckoned me and I arose to follow where you led. Out amongst the wild Clahinia hill. You stopped upon the fairy hill beneath the hawthorn tree. I thought I heard the lonely banshee scream. You held your hand toward me and I reached to touch your face, but woke to find that you were just a dream. Clahinia winds were blowing when you called me. First you spoke my name, your voice was still the same. You beckoned me, and I arose to follow where you led, out amongst the wild Kenya hill. Years have passed, and I am growing weary of this earth. The magic of the dream eludes me still. I've lain beneath the fairy tree, I've shouted to the moon. I am the haunted woman of the hill. The Henya winds were blowing when you called me. First you spoke my name, the voice was still the same. You beckoned me, and I arose to follow where you led, out amongst the wild.
Now, important for Bridget's song. First of all, it's a beautiful song written by Bridget herself and recorded by her and by many other artists. But beautiful because it mentions Tlahinya, which is the townland. And we've talked about townlands so often and the importance of townlands. But that whole supernatural feel, and especially on tonight, when the she walks, she talks in the song about the banshee, and I talked about the she taking the soul of Cuchulainn, and the banshee was the fairy woman who visited some families when it was coming to a death. But Michael J. said the fairies lived in fairy forts or racens, and were humoured by being allowed to show their superiority over ordinary people on such nights as Halloween. So here we are, and we're waiting on the fairies to come and put manners on us. But I'm going to hand you back over to Margaret, because one of the things that I suppose is important again, and one of the things that's been done here at An Tobar, is about the importance of slowing down and looking after yourself and looking after the people that are around you. So Margaret's going to finish with a piece here.
Yeah, and we're sitting here in the circle garden here at An Tobar, as Una said, waiting on the fairies to come. And I'm just going to read you a wee poem by John O'Donoghue, and I think it's very apt for tonight. This is the time to be slow. This is the time to be slow. Lie low to the wall until the bitter weather passes. Try as best you can not to let the wire brush of doubt scrape from your heart all sense of yourself and your hesitant light. If you remain generous, time will come good, and you will find your feet again on fresh pastures of promise, where the air will be kind and blushed with beginning.
So, as Margaret said, we're sitting in the Celtic Circle, and even though we're sitting here tonight, this was an idea from much further back, when Pat and Margaret and Kathleen and Pat, their father, were looking at this area and had already decided to honour the Celtic wheel. So if you come here to An Tobar, you'll see that it's laid out in the 4 Celtic quarter years in Ballag, Baltana, Lunasa and Samhain. So there couldn't have been a more apt place tonight to do this. You'll notice when you go back across this and look at it, that all of the participants tonight have been women, and that hasn't been just a chance either. That's how we wanted it to be. And we started off talking about the sacredness within the pagan people of water and the healing powers of water. And there are lots of other powers that water was useful for. So before we sort of finish off tonight, we're going to have a toast with Ishkabaha of a clear variety, which uses water in its mix. So I'm very sorry that you can't join us. But I'll have to tell you, and I will tell you, that it's very good. It's a very good brew. And none for the child, none for the child, but sláinte. And Guramayagat to the Mana, to the women of the Celts. And thank you very much to Destination Uri.
Thank you.
So we started, and now I'm going to say to you, Cahal, Ihawajan, go home, everybody, and go to your beds. Good night. Shinawel.
Hi, I'm Bernie